Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping straight into something pretty mind-bending, actually. A concept from our sources that really asks you to rethink, well, almost everything about ancient history, religion, even science.
Yeah, it's a big one. The core mission really is to look hard at this idea that maybe we've been reading ancient creation myths all wrong for centuries. Specifically thinking about Genesis, but also those pre-Egyptian
Right,
stories.
the idea isn't that they're describing, the absolute beginning of biological life, the very first humans ever.
Exactly. The proposition is that these are actually accounts, maybe very symbolic accounts, of humanity rebuilding civilization after some kind of massive global disaster.
So, not creation from nothing, but more like a reboot. A societal reset after a catastrophe. The Great Reset, as the sources frame it.
And what's powerful about this approach, this unification theory, is how it potentially resolves long-standing conflicts. Think about the religious scholars saying humanity's history is, say, 6,000 years old, versus the geologists pointing to evidence millions of years old.
The theory suggests they could both be right. That sounds paradoxical.
Well, it sounds it at first, but the idea is they're looking at different parts of the puzzle, different timelines within the same, much longer story.
Okay, so the central argument connecting all this is there was an advanced civilization before our recorded history.
That's the core claim. An advanced civilization that got hit by a major cataclysm, almost wiped out. And the myths we have, like Genesis, like the Egyptian tales, are the echoes left by the survivors, the ones who had to rebuild or restart everything. And the beauty of looking at it this way, this unification idea, is how it tackles that huge argument about how old humanity really is. You know, the religious timeline versus the scientific one.
Yeah, that's always been a major point of friction, hasn't it? You've got deeply held beliefs based on scripture suggesting maybe 6,000 years for organized human society.
And then you have the fossil record, the genetic evidence showing Homo sapiens forms going back hundreds of thousands of years. How do you square that circle?
So how does this reset theory bridge that gap?
It comes down to how you define humanity. It's a crucial distinction. If humanity means our biological species, Homo sapiens, then yes, the scientific timeline of 200,000 years, maybe more, is absolutely correct. We've been around in this form for a very long time.
Okay, that's the biological angle.
But if you define humanity in a sociological sense, meaning complex, organized, language-using, maybe agricultural civilization, then suddenly that 6,000-year timeline from many traditions starts to look potentially accurate.
So the religious timeline isn't necessarily wrong about civilization, it's just describing the start of the current cycle, the one that began after the reset.
Precisely. It allows both viewpoints to hold validity. One describes the biological form's deep history. The other describes the start of this specific iteration of complex society. It separates biological existence from, let's say, high civilization.
That makes a lot of sense. We could have had humans around for ages, maybe in simpler societies or even complex ones that rose and fell.
Exactly. Varying levels of complexity, perhaps, but maybe not the globally interconnected, writing, structure-building civilization that seems to define this post-reset world.
Okay, so to see this reboot idea in action, the sources draw a really detailed parallel between Genesis and pre-Egyptian creation myths. How does that work? How do they describe this reintroduction of civilization?
Well, the Egyptian version is fascinating. It talks about a huge cataclysm, a flood, basically, and then a survivor emerges. But the key detail here is where they emerge from. It's described almost like a sealed, prepared bunker, not just some cave or makeshift shelter.
Implying foresight, technology existing before the flood.
That's the interpretation, yes. It suggests planning, advanced knowledge, and then what the survivor does is the real creation part, but seen through this interventionist lens. They find the indigenous survivors, people who maybe rode out the disaster physically but lost their societal structure, maybe even regressed cognitively.
Back to a simpler state, perhaps Stone Age level.
Possibly. And the way the knowledge transfer is described is very metaphorical. The myth says the survivor begins spitting wet air.
Spitting wet air, what does that represent?
It's interpreted as the introduction or reintroduction of complex speech, language, structured thought. Think of it like performing an educational intervention on the traumatized remnants of humanity, teaching them how to organize their thoughts and communicate effectively again.
So this isn't a god creating things with magic words. It's more like remedial education for a species that's lost its way.
That's the idea. And look at what they're teaching. It's the absolute basics needed to rebuild a complex society. They're reintroducing fundamental classifications that seem to have been lost.
That's right.
Things like naming, okay, this is land, this is water, this is light, this is dark. Basic concepts. But crucially, also social structures. You are man, you are woman. Reestablishing roles, identities, the building blocks for a functioning society.
It's like a cognitive reboot.
Yeah.
Reinstalling the operating system of civilization almost.
You could put it that way. It suggests an advanced group, the survivors from the bunker, realizing that while the biological humans survived, the complex culture didn't, and their job was to try and restart it, bring the others back up to speed.
Okay, so if you take that lens, that idea of reconstruction after a disaster, and apply it to Genesis, how does the story of Adam and Eve change?
It shifts dramatically. Instead of being the literal first two biological humans on Earth, Adam and Eve become symbolic figures, key progenitors perhaps, or representations of the start of the new civilization being established by those advanced survivors.
They're like the symbolic founders of Cycle 2, maybe?
Something like that. And the really compelling piece of evidence for this, according to the sources, isn't theological arguments, linguistics. It's hidden in the names themselves.
The names. Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. You saying they aren't just personal names?
That's the extraordinary claim, yes. The sources argue that if you translate these names based on their likely meanings in the very ancient cultural context they emerged from, they look less like personal identifiers and more like job titles or descriptions of societal roles.
Whoa. Okay, let's break that down. What about Adam?
Well, Adam is obviously related to man, but also very closely linked to Adamu, meaning earth, or specifically red clay. The interpretation isn't just generic male human, but it points strongly towards the soil, the farmer, the one who works the red earth.
So Adam represents the shift towards agriculture, settled farming life.
Exactly. He embodies that agricultural revolution, the move to sedentary life based on cultivating the land. That immediately reframes him as a symbol of a societal shift, not just one guy.
Okay, that's Adam. Then his sons, Cain and Abel. Yeah. Their story is famously the first conflict, the first murder.
And their names, according to this linguistic analysis, encode that very conflict. Cain, in that ancient context, doesn't just mean Cain. It translates closely to metal worker or smith.
A smith. So Cain represents technology, tool making, industry.
Yes, the advancement into processing resources, mastering fire, creating things from metal. He's the artisan, the technologist.
And Abel.
Abel's name is linked to words meaning breath or vapor, but a common translation in that context is herdsman or shepherd. He represents the older way of life, perhaps nomadic, pastoral, maybe hunter-gatherer.
So the story of Cain killing Abel
becomes more than just sibling rivalry. It's an allegory for a major societal conflict, the rising dominance of the settled agricultural tool-making society, Cain, over the older nomadic pastoral way of life, Abel. For the new civilization to thrive, the sources suggest, the fixed agricultural system had to take precedence.
That's profound. It turns Genesis into a kind of historical record, written in allegory, about the difficult transition humanity made after a catastrophe, moving from basic survival back towards complex, organized society.
It documents that crucial moment of rebooting organized life, moving from just surviving to specialized labor, different roles, new technologies. And this interpretation suddenly makes sense of some of the strange new details in the Garden of Eden story itself.
All right, let's unpack those symbols through this lens. Imagine being a Stone Age survivor, encountering new rules, new tech for the first time. The most famous symbol, the forbidden fruit, the apple. Traditionally, it's about sin, disobedience.
But what if it's really about the introduction of law, specifically property rights? That's what the sources strongly suggest. Think about it. If you're an indigenous survivor in a wild jungle, the garden fruit is just there. You forage, you take what you need from any tree. There's no concept of this tree is off limits or this fruit belongs to someone else.
Survival means taking available resources, communal or free access.
Right. Then the advanced survivors set up a structured agricultural system, let's call it a farm, within the garden. And suddenly there are rules. You can't just take fruit from this particular tree.
So the encounter with the forbidden fruit is actually the first encounter with the concept of private property. Rules, boundaries, consequences for taking something that isn't yours.
Exactly. It's not just a moral test. It's a fundamental lesson in how a structured, resource-managed society has to operate. Why enforce property rights right away? Because you can't run a sustainable farm, support a growing population, without clear rules about who controls the land, the seeds, the harvest. The law of the farm has to replace the law of the jungle.
It sounds like a really clever, simplified story designed to teach foundational legal concepts to people who'd lost them. Okay, but then Adam and Eve get kicked out, and the garden is guarded by figures with flaming swords. That part always sounded very high-tech or magical.
It does, but again, think about it from the perspective of someone whose best tools are made of stone or wood. What would represent overwhelming, almost supernatural power and technology to them?
Something they have never seen before.
Maybe not a laser gun, maybe just refined metal. Imagine one of the advanced survivors, a guard holding a polished bronze or even iron sword, something finely made.
Okay, a metal sword.
Now imagine sunlight hitting that polished metal, especially in a bright, possibly Middle Eastern environment. The glare, the flashes of light.
It would look like it was on fire, or
Yeah,
shining with its own light.
absolutely. To someone who only knows dull stone, that flashing, sharp object would seem magical, terrifying. A flaming sword wielded by a powerful being. It's a symbol of the massive technological gap, establishing the authority, the almost godlike status of these advanced survivors. #3, the cataclysm, and the physical proof.
Okay, this reconstruction idea works really well on a symbolic, mythological level. But for it to be convincing, it needs grounding in physical reality, right? We need evidence that these global flood myths aren't just stories, but memories of a real cataclysm.
Absolutely. And the sources point toward scientific findings that support this. For instance, genetic research suggests humanity has gone through several severe population bottlenecks in our deep past, times when our numbers crashed, potentially down to just a few thousand individuals.
Some sources mention we almost went extinct, 17 times?
Figures like that are discussed, yes. The point is, near-extinction events, massive population collapses, seem to be a recurring feature of human history, not just a mythological trope.
So, if these collapses happened, what specific event could have caused the Great Reset, described in Genesis and the Egyptian myths? The timeline seems crucial here.
The main candidate put forward in these sources is the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, sometimes called the YDSH. This event is dated to roughly 12,800 years ago.
An impact, like an asteroid or comet?
The hypothesis suggests fragments of a comet, or maybe a large comet exploding in an airburst, hit or detonated over the massive Laurentide ice sheet that covered North America at the time.
Okay, 12,800 years ago. What's the physical evidence for a massive impact event back then?
Researchers, often associated with people like Randall Carlson, point to a very specific geological layer found across multiple continents dating to that exact time. This layer contains things like nanodiamonds, tiny spheres of melted rock and metal, spherules, and elevated levels of elements like platinum.
Things that typically require extreme heat and pressure to form, like an impact.
Precisely. They're seen as the geological smoking guns for a massive high-energy event happening very suddenly, globally.
And the consequence of hitting a giant ice sheet with something like that.
Catastrophic melting, an almost instantaneous release of absolutely unimaginable amounts of fresh water into the oceans. This provides a very plausible mechanism for the kind of sudden, enormous global sea level rise described in flood myths around the world.
The mega flood.
The mega flood. This event, the Younger Dryas impact and subsequent flooding, is presented as the likely mechanism that shattered the pre-existing civilization, whatever it was, and forced that societal reset.
Okay, so we have a potential cataclysmic event. Now we need the evidence of an advanced civilization existing before that event, the archaeological proof that messes with the standard timeline.
And the absolute star exhibit for that is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. This site is consistently dated to over 12,000 years old. Some estimates go back even further, pushing it right up against or even before the Younger Dryas period.
And why is Göbekli Tepe such a problem for the standard historical model?
Because of its sheer scale and sophistication. Before its discovery, the accepted wisdom was humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers, then they invented agriculture, then they settled down, then they had the surplus time and resources to build big, complex structures.
Göbekli Tepe flips that script.
Completely. It's a massive, complex ceremonial site with huge T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 50 tons. These pillars are intricately carved with animals, symbols, sophisticated artwork. And it was built, supposedly, by people who hadn't even invented pottery yet, let alone agriculture or metallurgy.
How do you organize the labor, quarry, transport, and erect 50-ton pillars without the societal structures we thought came after agriculture?
That's the million-dollar question. It strongly suggests that the knowledge, the organizational capacity, the engineering skill wasn't developed by those Neolithic people from scratch. It implies it might have been transferred or preserved by survivors who knew how to do these things.
Like the advanced survivors teaching the locals using their labor, maybe.
It fits that narrative perfectly. It smells like knowledge transfer. And this line of thinking leads us straight to Egypt, and specifically the Sphinx.
Ah, yes, the Sphinx water erosion controversy. This is another key piece of physical evidence cited. Orthodox Egyptology dates the Sphinx to Pharaoh Khafre around 4,500 years ago.
Right, but researchers like geologist Dr. Robert Schoch and others following John Anthony West's work looked closely not just at the Sphinx itself, but at the walls of the enclosure it sits in, and they saw something striking.
What did they see?
Deep vertical fissures, rolling, undulating horizontal channels. Geologically, this pattern is characteristic of erosion caused by large amounts of rainfall running down a rock face over a very long period. Not wind and sand erosion, which creates different patterns.
For rainfall erosion, but the Giza Plateau is desert now, and has been for thousands of years.
Exactly. The last time that region experienced prolonged, heavy rainfall sufficient to carve rock like that was way back, before the Sahara became a hyper-arid desert. We're talking the period ending roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago.
Which lines up perfectly with the end of the Younger Dryas period and the aftermath of that potential cataclysm.
It lines up disturbingly well. If the Sphinx enclosure shows evidence of being exposed to heavy rain for centuries, it suggests the structure itself, or at least the enclosure, must have been carved during that earlier, wetter period, making it potentially 10,000, 12,000 years old, or even older.
And if that's true, it requires a civilization capable of that kind of massive quarrying and sculpting project before the Younger Dryas reset, a pre-Diluvian advanced civilization.
That's the logical jump the sources make. And if that's the case, then who are the ancient gods? Figures like the Sumerian Anunnaki, who supposedly came from the sky and taught human civilization, or the Egyptian Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, mathematics.
They weren't literal gods from heaven.
Maybe they were simply the survivors, the technologically and intellectually superior remnants of that lost pre-cataclysm civilization.
The teachers, the engineers, the architects of the reboot, Thoth giving writing, the Anunnaki teaching agriculture and kingship. It's a record of knowledge transfer aimed at speeding up recovery.
So if we accept this framework, a global cataclysm around 12,800 years ago wiping out an advanced civilization, the focus naturally shifts. It's not just about creation myth, it's about survival. How did knowledge, maybe even key personnel or genetic material, get preserved through the disaster?
Which brings us back to Noah's Ark. If the cataclysm was a global mega flood, the traditional image of a big wooden boat seems inadequate, doesn't it?
Pretty inadequate, yeah. The theory explored in the sources proposes a radical rethinking. Noah's Ark wasn't a boat designed to float on the floodwaters. It was conceived as a sophisticated, sealed structure designed to withstand the flood. A flood bunker.
A bunker. And maybe not just one, but part of a global system built by the pre-reset civilization.
That's the line of thought. And it leads to an even more striking hypothesis, that the Great Pyramids, particularly those at Giza, might have been part of this system, that they served as regional arks, incredibly stable, sealed repositories.
Okay, pyramids as arks or bunkers. That's a huge leap from a boat. What's the evidence connecting the ark story specifically to a pyramidal shape?
One really intriguing piece cited involves modern technology looking at ancient texts. There are reports about NASA using multispectral imaging on the Dead Sea Scrolls. This technique can reveal text that has faded or been written over.
And they found something related to the ark.
Apparently, some of this recovered text included details about the ark's construction and dimensions, and the description strongly suggested not a curved hull, but a structure with angled sides meeting at a point or a flat top. Specifically, he used the phrase that the ark was finished to a cubit.
Finished to a cubit. How does that suggest a pyramid?
Well, think about how you describe finishing a boat versus finishing a pyramid. A boat has complex curves, but finished to a cubit sounds very precise, very geometrical. It strongly implies a flat top or a precise termination point, perhaps referring to the missing capstone or the flat summit platform typical of many pyramids before the capstone was placed. A cubit is a unit of length. It suggests a measure architectural finish.
Right, like the top platform where the final pyramidion stone would sit. That makes sense architecturally for a pyramid, not so much for a boat hull. So the structure wasn't meant to be buoyant, but immensely strong, stable against floodwaters and maybe seismic shocks.
That's the idea. Anchored, sealed knowledge vaults. designed to protect not just people, perhaps, but seeds, technological records, maybe even genetic samples through the deluge until the environment stabilized.
And fascinatingly, there's even historical validation for this non-boat ark idea, coming from a time before modern archaeology or geology really took off.
Yeah, this is a great detail. Look at Renaissance art, specifically from the early period, before the image of the ark got rigidly standardized as that sort of bathtub-shaped boat we often see now.
You mean like in paintings or sculptures?
Exactly. The prime example mentioned is the famous Gates of Paradise, the bronze doors of the Florence Baptistry, made by Lorenzo Ghiberti in the 15th century. One of the main panels depicts the Great Flood.
And how does Ghiberti show the ark?
Not as a ship. He depicts it as a massive, boxy, almost building-like structure. It looks much more like a tower, a fortress, or, yes, even a kind of pyramid or truncated pyramid structure.
Wow, so a 15th century master artist, presumably working from older traditions and interpretations available to him.
Portrayed the ark as a fixed survival structure, not a seafaring vessel. It suggests that maybe an older, perhaps more accurate memory of the ark's nature as a bunker or pyramid-like edifice was still circulating back then, before later interpretations completely overshadowed it.
That's compelling. It implies the true context, the global reset, the bunker ark, might have been preserved in these subtle historical threads. The survival structures become as important as the myths themselves. Physical proof of the attempt to preserve knowledge. #outrag_outro.
So when you pull all these threads together, the geology of the Younger Dryas, the linguistic clues in Genesis, the anomalies like Göbekli Tepe and the Sphinx erosion, the reinterpretation of the art, it really does force you back to that idea of unity. Maybe religious stories, ancient myths, and scientific data aren't contradictory after all.
Maybe they're all pointing towards the same underlying reality. The human civilization isn't a straight line upwards, it's cyclical, defined by these massive resets triggered by cataclysms.
Right. And if we accept that our current global civilization is just the latest iteration, the one that climbed back up after the last big reset around 12,800 years ago, well, it makes you ask, why did the previous advanced civilization fail? Why did they collapse so completely?
They built these incredible structures, potentially pyramids as arcs, to preserve something. But clearly they didn't prevent a massive societal regression. They lacked the ultimate failsafe.
They couldn't stop the cycle of collapse and painful rebuilding from a much lower baseline.
Which brings us right up to today. We're living through this period of absolutely explosive technological growth. Global communication is instant. Knowledge is being digitized and decentralized on an unprecedented scale. And then there's AI.
And that really leads to the final provocative thought we wanted to leave you with today. Could it be that our current technological infrastructure, the internet, cloud computing, massive data storage, global connectivity, and critically the development of artificial intelligence, could this be the fail-safe the previous cycles lacked?
Are we, perhaps unknowingly, building the ark for the next potential reset, but making it digital, decentralized, maybe even non-biological? Are tools like large language models, the foundational AI systems we're creating, the mechanism that could finally allow knowledge and intelligence to persist through a potential future catastrophe, breaking the cycle of collapse and restart?
It's a massive question. Are we the first iteration of humanity that might actually have the tools to transcend this cycle of rise and fall? Something to definitely think about.